Hi everyone. Nice to have you. So that's initially it was planned to be a breakout session. So as you can guess, I don't have as much time as I wished. Plus my predecessor took a few minutes also, so I had to shorten it a little bit. So as it's being recorded, so I have to modify part of the agenda. So it's basically, I have to remove this and that. So it's going to be about the good things that VCF provides. So I believe, or at least I hope, everyone knows nowadays what the VCF is, and we don't have to talk about the details. But I wanted to share some experience from the field that I've got with customers, maybe some hints that you will find hopefully useful. So what to avoid and what to pay attention, maybe. And the first thing, the concept of VCF, there is the idea of workload domains, which is like a kind of enhanced cluster. So in the past we had separate clusters for different type of workloads, management, databases, production, test, whatever. Now we can do it also from the licensing perspective. We don't have to worry about another license for vCenter. So we can separate it on the workload domain level. And that's a well-known concept nowadays, but still not everyone is aware of that. So the first hint, when you work with customers or internal stakeholders, make sure that they are aware of that. So not so long ago, I had a customer that purchased VCF, the licensing hardware and so on. I was engaged with an architecture phase and the initial deployment. And during the first, that was a public customer, so they had to follow some rules. But during the first workshop, then the customer had a bad day, I think. Because they did the initial sizing based on what they needed, the number of servers, the number of storage, but they didn't, and they loved the idea of VCF. They've seen some presentations, mostly pre-sales, but they didn't know the technical details. So they had a couple of surprises the first day. One, the management domain that's going to eat 4 servers. They were not prepared for that. Another one was vSAN. Of course, they wanted vSAN. They bought 6.48 terabyte disks, plenty of them, 200 plus. That was like 4.5 petabytes of the raw capacity. And they did the sizing based on their needs, but they didn't consider the cache layer. So they were surprised that the cache doesn't contribute to storage. And out of like 4.5 petabytes, suddenly they've got 3.5 of usable capacity. So that's, hopefully it's not happening often, but always make sure that your customers are aware of that. Aware of the architecture. It's of course changing and evolving, so VCF, maybe one step back. So VCF, it's not only the automation, it's also the standardized and structured approach to the design and architecture, which usually is great because it's solving lots of problems and challenges, but on the other hand, from the architecture perspective, that's a constraint. I cannot do whatever I would like to do. Therefore, we have to keep in mind the dependencies, what we can, what we cannot do. And that's also changing and evolving from version to version. Now it's, I would say, getting more and more relaxed than it used to be in the past. But a good example is enhanced linked mode. So in the past, all the workload domains you were creating had to be part of the same SSO domain. So we had the enhanced linked mode with a single management console for all our vCenters, which from manageability standpoint, it's great. I don't need to open 5 or 10 different windows or tabs in my browser, wasting the memory resources on my notebook. But is it always positive? Are there any considerations we should take into account? So should we use enhanced linked mode always? Depends, but we have to remember about the drawback. So what's the drawback of enhanced linked mode? There are extra coins if you know the answer. Yeah, and that's something that lots of administrators are not aware of. Okay, I've got 5 vCenters, they are all linked, but what we are going to do during the upgrade processor, perfect, VCF will automate it, but what if we need to do a rollback? I will take a snapshot, great, but if you are updating the 5 vCenters in a row, and the 5th one has some problem, and you want to revert back to the snapshot, you should, officially, you have to revert all of them. So that's the biggest, I think, disadvantage of having enhanced linked mode. The other consideration is related to NSX instances. This is also changing, but we've got two options. We can have a dedicated NSX instance or shared NSX instance. Pros and cons of both, but remember about the potential downsides. So if I've got it doesn't affect the licensing, so we don't have to consider it from the cost perspective, but if I've got a shared NSX instance across multiple workload domains, first of all, they will be automatically part of the same transport zone, which might be expected, might be not. Second, we might be forced to use the same lifecycle method. It's changing, again, evolving, but that's something to consider. What about edges? We can deploy edges from SDDC Manager. Should we? Always? Or not? Has anyone deployed or if you've got the VCF environment, have you ever deployed or decided to deploy edges directly in NSX Manager, not in SDDC Manager? Yeah. So, should we do that? There is no single answer. Yeah, there are, again, pros and cons. So if I do it from SDDC Manager, we've got the automation, out-of-the-box automation, password rotation stuff, but we also have some potential drawbacks, because what we are going to do if it fails, the procedure of restoring might be a little bit affected by that. Probably that's not something we will do in production, but maybe I want to have a single edge in an edge cluster, which shouldn't be called an edge cluster then, but in NSX I can do that. VCF will not allow me doing that, which is, I would say in this case, positive, because definitely if I've got a cluster there should be at least 2 nodes, but that's some considerations. Plus, what happens when we deploy edges in VCF versus what happens when we deploy edges in NSX? In NSX we just get edges. In VCF it's also changing, but as a rule of thumb we are also getting tier 1, tier 0, and potentially the routing. Maybe instead of BGP I would like to use OSPF. Can I do that in SDDC Manager? Not right now. The other question is whether we should use OSPF in bigger environments. Probably not, but maybe we won't. Yeah, and this is also, again, it's constantly evolving, and you've heard a lot of stuff about VCF 9, which is going to completely, change the product. But there are still lots of constraints that are from the past in terms of routing, for example. So whether we will have edges, as a rule of thumb, I would say yes, let's go with SDDC Manager deployed edges, but you need to be aware of the processes that will be affected by that. Yeah, so it's not only the positive, but could be also the negative. And now my favorite. Who's from Germany? Okay. Yeah, so I've heard from a couple of people that in Germany everyone wants to use stretch cluster, which I don't agree, because it's not only in Germany. I think it's not as common in US as it is in Europe. But also something I hear very often, also from German customers, is can we actually put the witness node or witness appliance in the same or in one of the data sites? And the answer is no, don't do that. Obviously, that first of all doesn't make sense, doesn't satisfy the requirement, because if I put the witness in this site and I lose that site, there is no reason of having stretch cluster in this case. Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether you've got a stretch cluster across racks, server rooms, or rows in a data center, or data centers, or sites, like proper one, the witness should be in a separate one. Never ever put it in a data site. The other thing is the dark side of the automation. So usually the automation is great. You want to automate and save time. Now, if I can automate something and save some time to play some video games, that's always highly welcome. But obviously, there are some challenges with automation. First of all, if we've got an automation, and if the automation works as expected, great. But we know how it is in the real world. It doesn't always work as expected. And the biggest challenge starts when it fails, and we have to investigate what happened. So obviously, in this case, knowing, again, the structure of VCF and what the processes looks like is going to be definitely helpful. But first of all, we should avoid making things that can potentially break the automation. And getting back to the architecture, it's again standardized, which is based on the VMware proven practices that will fit most of the customers, but not necessarily everyone. So therefore, we need to keep that in mind when we are making some changes that normally we know how to do. We've done it hundreds of times. That might not be necessarily possible, supported, or even allowed in VCF. So the first thing, changing names. Doesn't, first of all, probably we don't change names very often, but there are customers, admins that are doing that for various reasons. So the first rule of thumb here is that if something was created, provisioned by SDDC manager, so VCF in general, don't touch it unless you've got a very valid reason, because that can break a lot. So simply changing the name of a data center object or a cluster shouldn't be a problem, but it could be a problem for SDDC manager. And the challenge is that you are not going to realize it immediately. You will find out that something doesn't work when you do the update, when you've got a tight maintenance window, and you have to investigate what happened. So changing names in general, but also any kind of modification to distributed switches, I would say. So an example, that's an example, quite old one, from VCF 3. something. I was doing a deployment for a customer. At that time there was NVDS, so the process was that the standard switch was at the beginning, then the distributed switch was created, and finally everything was moved to NVDS. Now NVDS is gone, but that was the old process. And after the bring up, we were ending up with a distributed switch where hosts were added to this distributed switch, but no interfaces were mapped to it. So that was producing ugly warning saying there is no redundancy. So what I did for a customer, okay, there is a warning. Those hosts are not, the distributed switch is not in use. So let's simply fix the problem and remove those hosts from the distributed switch. That's what I did. Everything works fine. Fortunately, I didn't delete the distributed switch. That would be a bigger problem. And of course, everything works fine, no issues, until a couple of weeks later, a colleague of mine, or the customer actually, was adding some additional hosts to the existing workload domain, existing cluster. Obviously, it failed with a not so user-friendly error, but it was alluding to the distributed switch. Fortunately, it was just a couple of weeks after the initial deployment, so I did remember what I did. When I added those hosts back to the distributed switch, again, without uplinks, everything worked fine. So that still happens. In VCF 9, it's meant to be relaxed. It's meant to be some kind of data collection, so it should automatically pick up the changes that you did on the vCenter. But that's a main rule of thumb. Same like with other products. If you are using Cloud Director, automation, if something was created by Cloud Director, you shouldn't modify it on the lower level. If there is a resource pool created by Cloud Director, don't touch it in vCenter. Don't remove it. That can break a lot of things. So that's the other thing. The next one is the lifecycle management, which might be tempting to do some updates and upgrades directly from vCenter, from NSX, but obviously that will fail your workflows in the future. So if you will try to update the environment later, that's not going to be successful. Of course, there are some fixes you can synchronize or modify and update the database, but that's not something we want to do on a daily basis, definitely. And the next thing is as simple as adding, this will again change in the future, but still adding hosts, making modification to the network of those hosts, it's not a good idea. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes when you plan to make significant changes, it might be worth to consider even a redeploy of a workload domain or a cluster instead of making changes that, because from my perspective, the challenge with automation is that you never know what kind of check developers are going to implement and when and where. So it might be working fine today after your changes, but tomorrow or the next couple of weeks with the next release might be not the case anymore. Plus, another challenge that I hear from customers is, so there are lots of constraints that I shouldn't do that in vCenter, in vCenter or in NSX. But is there a list of what's allowed what should I do from SDDC Manager? What should I do in vCenter? Unfortunately, there is no such list, which is also a challenge. You can play with permissions, but unfortunately, there is also no out-of-the-box role that you might know from like AWS. In AWS, that's solved. There is a role, administrator role, with limited privileges, so you cannot add hosts, remove hosts. It should be same in VCF, in my opinion, but it's not. So you can create your own custom role for administrators that are dealing on the vCenter level or NSX. But also you should think about the other activities that will be affected by SDDC Manager. Because for example, deployment of NSX or vCenter, we do it by SDDC Manager. But the restore, we do it with traditional procedures. If there is something that you are not so sure whether can I do it from SDDC or can I do it in vCenter or should I do it in SDDC Manager, I would recommend to always open a service request, which I know might take some time, but having kind of insurance on paper in an email that yeah, you can do that and we will support it, or no, you cannot do that because this and that, I think it's quite important, especially in VCF environment, because there are so many dependencies. And that's something you might not be able to fix on your own in the future. But apart from opening a service request, it's a little bit like with the security topic. So in security, make your user aware, train them to make sure that they are not making mistakes, that they are not doing those things that they should not. And it's a little bit similar in VCF. So you should be prepared for that, educate your users, make sure they are aware of it, and that's definitely the standard operating procedures should be your friend. So make sure that they are updated. Even though you've got processes for vCenter NSX that you were using in the past, make sure that they are updated to the VCF reality. And the last question, is anyone using VVS? Anyone aware of VVS? VMware Validated Solutions? You might remember Validated Design. Okay, I see. So the VMware Validated Solution, this is a map. What kind of city is that? Which city is it? Exactly, that's New York. To be precise, the Manhattan map. And that wasn't my idea, so I actually borrowed it from a colleague of mine, but I believe it's pretty good. So that's the map of the Manhattan. It's maybe a little bit blurry. I know it's upside down, but I didn't want to put it vertical. It would be too small. But if you look at the left side, which is the old part, which used to be called New Amsterdam. And on the right, we've got let's say, the new part with the Central Park. So again, it's blurry, but you might see that they are quite different. The old one is a little bit messy. So it's a little bit like in the past we had the vSphere environments. You just recall like 10, 15 years ago when you maybe did deploy vSphere for the first time. Everyone was excited. Yeah, I will be able to move virtual machine live. Something I wasn't able to do in the past. So we were so excited to get it up and running. Nobody was paying attention to whether this is the best configuration, whether this is right. Let's just get it running. And then it was evolving. We were adding more hosts, more clusters, additional configuration. Probably the administrator who initially did it doesn't work in the company anymore. And we've got this kind of mess, which works, but nobody wants to touch it to not break it. The right side is representing what we do with VCF and VMware Validated Solutions. That's a structured approach. So you can see, even if you haven't been in New York at all, I'm pretty sure that if you know the rules, and if I drop you at any point on the right side, you will be able to get back to your hotel or where you plan to go. You will just go to the corner of the street, see which street I'm on, and what's there, and you can navigate to the right place. So it's very well structured. We know that there are some rules, like you cannot build anything probably in the Central Park unless you've got unlimited budget or I don't know. So everyone knows how it works. And the VMware Validated Solution, which is kind of evolution of VMware Validated Design, but mostly and only, it's only for VCF environments, so we need the VCF as a foundation. But VCF doesn't cover everything. VCF doesn't cover disaster recovery. VCF doesn't cover the private cloud. VCF doesn't cover AVI load balancing and a few other things. So if you want to add them on top of VCF, You can do it on your own with a tailored solution, or you can use VMware Validated Solution, which is not only describing like a reference architecture, but in most cases it's also giving you the kind of automation to do it. So that's an additional automation that can be added on top of VCF. Of course, you can do it without a VCF environment if you've got the legacy one, but that's mostly tailored and shaped to be on top of VCF. So that's mostly, I did it within the time. So that's my core slides. If you are collecting the coins for the Broadcom rewards, that's a surprise session, so you can scan the QR codes and get some additional coins. Are there any questions? If there are, I will stay for some time here. Happy to talk. Get your points. Thank you.